Classes in session. Hey everybody, and welcome to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session. Today I'm going all the way across Ontario with Janis Irwin, member of Legislative Assembly out in Alberta, NDP, rocking the house, making all sorts of waves. You guys call yourself members of Legislative Assembly, where we're MPPs, member of Provincial Parliament.
Yeah,
It's a little
exactly.
East Coast, West Coast thing. What is it like? What is it like out there? What is it like under Danielle Smith? What is it like being NDP in the energy resource capital of Canada?
Oof. Wow.
What first thing comes? I know you're a teacher, so like I'm grabbing all these things. I know you're a teacher. I feel like we both came out later in life. You were a teacher. All of a sudden, you're in politics. I'm getting some shoves to go in that arena. If you were to say like one thing about where you stand, where you grew up in Alberta, where you stand, your background, the first thing that comes to mind? You get like a sentence. You get like a quick sentence.
Yeah, I mean, quick sentence, queer politician in Alberta, there's a lot to unpack there.
That's
I mean,
true.
yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I gotta say things have shifted a bit because I was first elected in 2019, and I was the only queer politician in Alberta at the time, and now fast forward 4 years, I've been joined by a couple more, so that's good news. I'm
Right,
sorry,
right.
I'm also joined by my cat Oregano today, so
That's
just
fair.
in case people are wondering, yeah, I know they
Well,
can't
just so
see it on the
everybody knows,
podcast.
that's a bylaw in Alberta. If a lesbian politician is sitting on camera, she must have her respective cat next to her.
Yeah, exactly. It's the law, so I'm glad that law transcends provincial boundaries. This is
We
good to hear.
understand. We understand. So you step into this arena. So you're a teacher for how many years?
So I didn't teach actually all that long. I started teaching when I was very young. I had just turned 21 and I was teaching like high school. So I had like 19-year-old boys in my class, which was fun. Keep in mind though, I was straight, I'm using quotation marks for the people listening, straight back then.
Right.
And, I wasn't out and I was dating men and all that. So I wasn't dealing with all of that at the time when I was teaching. But yeah, I didn't teach all that long. I taught for about 6 years in rural Alberta. And then I came to Edmonton, the big
Right.
city.
And then because you were getting your PhD, you just haven't defended your dissertation from what I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So I did my master's when I was out teaching in rural Alberta, and then I came back to Edmonton. I thought, you know what, why not do my PhD? But I ended up running for office. Ended up running federally in 2015, and so I stepped away from my PhD and didn't come back to it. So maybe one day if I don't continue with politics.
So you ran federally. What happened there?
Yeah, so ran federally. So I launched that campaign in 2013. I thought we had a really good chance in that election. Put 2 years of my life into it, but it was a close loss. And the
Who
conservative
took that seat?
a conservative member of parliament at the time.
Mm.
But so it was like a heartbreaker. But
Yeah.
the good news is, let's see, you had to do some math there. I was not a math teacher, by the way, Joanna. 6 years later, we ended up winning that seat. So a young two-spirit member of parliament named
Oh,
Blake Desjardins. So, sweet victory about 6 years later, right? That vengeance and was really awesome. I put a lot of steps into that campaign because I wanted us to win, and
right.
we have an amazing guy there now. So it all worked
So
out.
so you ran federally and then ran provincially and won that seat.
Exactly. Yeah. So ran federally, lost, stayed involved in politics. And then 4 years later, so I lost in 2015. 4 years later, I ran provincially and I was successful and then ran again and just got reelected in May.
Your first term, you step into COVID.
Yeah.
That's it. That's your first.
No, but you know what? And here's where we should start on this. You know what the first, so one of the very first things, so I was elected in 2019, and I'm just gonna take this wherever we want, right?
I love it. Yeah. Any direction. Just have
Yeah,
at.
okay, you just cut me off if I'm rambling too
All
much. But
right. All right.
so what happened is Jason Kenney had campaign in that campaign of like, no divisive, and again I'm using quotes, he was like, I'm not going to campaign on any divisive social issues, and his slogan during that campaign was jobs, economy, pipelines, right? That kind of thing. And so I got elected and I was appointed the critic for status of women and 2S LGBTQ issues. Again, this was April 2019, just to give you some time context. And people right away were like, whoa, Janis, to LGBTQ issues, this is going to be controversial. And I was like, you know what? I doubt it, because Jason Kenney has said he's not going to talk about these things. He wants to stay away. He wants to focus on the economy.
Right.
I was wrong. I was dead wrong, because and just for folks who weren't following Alberta politics very closely, one of the very first pieces of legislation that they brought in just after we were elected in 2019 was Bill 8, and that effectively made it more difficult for young people to access GSAs in schools. It made Alberta the first province in Canadian history to actually roll back to LGBTQ plus rights, right?
How did it do that? Can you explain that just a little bit? What did the
Yeah.
bill do in schools? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, and again, like I always say, like, I'm not the lawyer. I'm surrounded by lawyers in our caucus who I get to explain bills to me, because I'm like, can you explain this to me? And then they do. And then I'm like, okay, bring it down a level. Okay, maybe once more. Yeah. So I always need a little bit of help. But essentially, so a couple of things. It made it more difficult for kids to access GSAs. What had happened under previous legislation is if a student at a school was like, hey, went to their principal and was like, hey, I want to start a GSA, there was like an immediacy clause, like the principal had to respond, had to act. That was all removed.
Okay.
So basically, a kid could ask and say, like, listen, I don't feel safe, and the administration could just
ignore it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? And made it more possible for for kids to be outed to their parents, and just like, it was just a very very gross piece of legislation, because the UCP very much framed it as, oh no, we're helping, actually helping protect kids. And no, it's the same. And this is why. And in fact, I just, for anybody who follows me, I just posted a video of me speaking in 2019 during that debate, because it's the same debate that's coming up now, right? And under the guise, and this is
always
where
is
under the guise of parental rights, right? Just the same conversation you're having in Ontario and across the country. So there was very much that far right contingent in the UCP's ear saying, like, you need to talk about this, because Jason Kenney said he wasn't going to talk about it, right? Was going to stay away from those issues. Clearly, there was enough of a voice in their head saying you need to touch on this, even though it is going to be controversial. And the really shitty thing about that, sorry, I probably shouldn't say shitty, but I did there, so I did it again. The really crappy thing about that was, like, so many Albertans spoke out, and like we were inundated with stories from parents, from teachers, from students, how GSAs did save their lives, or how they would have helped them when they had been kids. When they were kids, right, in schools. And I talked about this, the fact that I know I didn't do enough as a teacher, and we need to do, we need to do more now, right?
I think they probably would have framed it, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm Jason Kenney, heaven help me. The way that I would frame it would be, listen, teachers have a lot on their plates. They don't need extra clubs. They don't need these clubs that clearly identify who the gay kids are in the school, because if we clearly identify who the gay kids are in the school, it makes it easier for bullies. And this is just highlighting an issue. We're already putting a lot of pressure on our teachers who are already overworked. We can't have this immediacy clause, because the immediacy clause might negate mathematics that whole year, because now they need to make a GSA. Am I on the right path?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't really talk about that, because, Lord knows Jason Kenney would never actually acknowledge teachers. So no, but yeah, but again, it was just very much this nod to the far right, to be like, oh, don't worry, we're protecting your kids. When I know I've got my Protect Trans Kids shirt on right now. We know these are just the same ill-informed conversations, right? And again, this idea, and what we're hearing a lot in Alberta right now, which I'm sure you're hearing there too. And it was just so incredibly disheartening to be at the protests here last week, because the misinformation that's being spread throughout communities about what's happening in schools, none of that's happening, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the huge thing. I think a lot of, I speak however I speak on TikTok, however I speak on here, but I really do love engaging with people that disagree with me fundamentally. As long as they can give an intellectual sort of conversation. Why? Because I think we're doing an incredible disservice when we're listening to such ridiculous ridiculous statements about what's going on in school, and then people are just rolling with them, and they're never, because they're so far out of the way of, of the center, and they're so far distantly removed from intelligent thoughts, like, well, I'm not talking to those idiots anymore. Well, there's the problem, because we're not talking about it. We're not going point by point by point by point, because as soon as you do that, as soon as you go point by point, they're gone. You'll either win people over and they'll go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't know that. Or the people that are just going to exist in their own world. Listen, I don't know what to do about those. The people that are fixated on, like, there's kitty litters in the classroom, like those people, I don't know, I can't do a thing. I'm just going to let them roll. But I think the discussions are incredibly important to have, especially when it comes to, because as soon as you say, it's like they have go-to words, which I won't repeat because we can't repeat certain words on this platform, but there's go-to words, right? As soon as anybody talks about health education for young people, oh, and there's that lovely G word they love to throw out, left, right, and center, and it's just so debasing and so ridiculously on the attack. But holy crap, when you throw that word out there, it's like, boom, you just have fireworks left, right, and center, right? What's the, just out of curiosity, because I know that Kathleen Wynne, when she was premier here, and Doug Ford's done what he did, but she really changed the elementary health and sex education curriculum, and people lost their minds. Grade ones don't need to be knowing about sex. Nobody was ever teaching them about sex, Becky. But like grade one, they would just do anatomy. And then grade two, they would do, consent. And then and it seemed completely rational if you read the curriculum.
Yeah.
Is that the same out there?
And that's the exact, your last point there, if they read the curriculum. And this is the challenging part. I think you and I are very similar because, you said, like, you want to engage with people who disagree. And I do
Absolutely.
too. I think it's it's a teacher in us who wants to, yeah, I want to educate and I want to inform and I want to explain to these folks who
Mm-hmm.
who are literally, like, there are people who were literally saying at these protests here in Edmonton, Alberta, that kids were getting gender surgery in schools.
Like the
Like,
back of the school. Yeah.
right,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah, sure.
And so, I mean, not only does that have nothing to do with curriculum, but that is absolutely, like, just, and I guess here's where people like you and me and others come in, where we've got a lot of work to do, because there's an education piece, because I truly believe, there were a lot of people that protest on the side that I wasn't on, that were there because they genuinely care about their kids and heard that these awful things are happening in schools, right? They're not bad people.
They're
But
fearful. They're being, yeah, 100%. They're being manipulated and led by fear. And the strongest touchstone of that fear you can ever tap into is somebody's kids. It's a
exactly.
brilliant move, sadistic, but brilliant by the other side of the aisle, because that's the pressure point. That's their Achilles heel. That's the part you go after, and well, if I can convince them, even even if it's happened one time in the past 50 years, where something untoward has happened in one school, in whatever, and I can tell them it's them, and right now it's the trans community, they're the problem, right? But
Exactly.
let's be
Exactly.
honest, and heaven help me from what's gone on in federal government recently, certain people are always looking to point the finger and say it's them, whether it's 1939 Germany, whether it's Donald Trump looking south of the border, in 1919, whatever it happens to be. Because if we can look to a group of people and we can say, your life is bad because of them. If I can, I'm going to take care of them and everything's going to get better. And for people who are scared, who lack the knowledge, whose lives have substantially gotten worse for whatever number of reasons, they want to believe that. Like, they want to believe that, right?
Yeah, and I gotta say, there were a lot of newcomers to Canada at the protests, and a lot of folks
Mm,
who, again, I get it. You came to our country because you wanted better life and better education for your kids. So I get
mhm.
it that you're hearing these messages and you're, like you said, you're fearful. And so, I didn't answer your question there, typical politician, but on the piece around curriculum, right? Like, so
Right.
So that's my background, John. I worked in curriculum for years. When
Yes.
I came back to Edmonton after being a teacher, so here we'll just keep interspersing my life story in here. It'll be
I
like
like
this
it. I like
little,
it. It's
little
like for
weeds.
the love of the game, when they're pitching, he's pitching that no hitter. Yeah.
That's right. It's like we planned this. Okay, now back to Janis's
Right.
life. So what had happened is I took a job, a secondment. So what is supposed to be a 3-year position, working in the big city on curriculum, and then the plan was I would go back to rural Alberta. Well, plans don't always work out as predicted, and so ended up staying in Edmonton, got a permanent job working on curriculum, and that's where I started getting more involved with the NDP, and one thing led
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
another, right? All that to say, we don't have this radical curriculum at all. In fact, most of our curriculum is quite outdated, and it was the NDP, and this is where some of the challenges come from. It was the NDP who started a curriculum renewal when they were in government from 2015 to 2019. So they started that in about 2016. And I'm not going to lie, part of that was revamping social studies. Of course, we have
Sure.
social studies here in Alberta, and our health and wellness curricula to be more up to date.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those documents, health and wellness in particular, there's some of it, like our high school document, which is called Career and Life Management. That's it's nearly the same document that I learned from, and I'm not. Although I look very young, I'm not. And so, yeah, just joking. But so a lot of these documents needed updating, right? There's no discussion of these 21st century issues:
Right.
reconciliation, climate change, diversity, perspectives on gender, all those things, right? So yes, the NDP had done some of that. Was it extremely radical, and were there, these far left concepts that you're hearing about? No, I mean it was just a
What
lot
was the
more.
most radical thing? Give me an example.
Like there would have been and again, these are drafts because they never ended up. So what happened? I should finish the story because people are
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
well,
Sorry.
what
Go
are you
ahead.
talking about, Janet? No, I just realized this is me rambling. So yeah, what happened is the we didn't get to fulfill that curriculum renewal. The documents were working on for years. Hundreds of thousands of Albertans were consulted. Then there was an election, and then we lost that election, right?
Oh, I see. So nothing
So
got implemented.
exactly. That's exactly it. So the development process, but not the implementation process. So the UCP comes in and they're, this radical NDP curriculum. We're going to scrap all that, right? And again,
Oh,
what are things that are radical to the UCP? Yeah, mentions of climate change, gender.
right.
I'm not going to lie. There was, there were conversations about things like
Just the
gender and
words.
identity. Yeah, right. And so that was obviously another like wedge for the UCP to be like, oh, look, the NDP wants to indoctrinate your kids, which again,
Right.
it's very similar to updated curriculum documents across the country, right? Like there's nothing extreme there. But that's where we're at right now is they've moved forward with some of the drafts of the like that the UCP have worked on, but there hasn't been full on curriculum renewal across the board. A lot of the curriculum documents in schools right now in K to 12 in Alberta are very outdated.
Okay. Well, it's similar to a lot that's gone on. So when Kathleen Wynne passed all of that in Ontario, Doug Ford came back in and he put it all back, I think, to 1999 standards.
Wow. Yep.
He thought curriculum from 23 years ago was better than talking to young kids about consent, for the love of God. Um, but
Exactly.
again, but again, he did it under the auspice of veiled notions of sexualizing your kids and veiled notions of all of this stuff, but never actually stipulating what was involved in each curricula point, what was involved in grade 1, what was involved in grade 2. When you have young girls in grade 4 getting their menstrual cycles, it makes pretty good sense that you talk about periods in that grade. It's a no-brainer. That's reality. If you don't want it to be reality, I don't know what to tell you, but that's reality. So curriculum and education should reflect the reality of people living in those particular, that particular situation. So it made perfect sense. But again, since he didn't talk about it, and let's be honest, if any of you guys have ever sat at home and tried to read through a curriculum document, you can understand that it's overwhelming, it's long, and it's relatively subjective in a lot of different ways, right? And I should do a whole thing on curriculum. I could do a whole thing on just one element of curriculum. It would bore the
Yeah.
hell out
I
of my
think you and
listeners.
I could rant all day. Yeah.
Well, and it because it's so hard, because what people don't understand is it doesn't say teach A, B, and C for 15 minutes each using these talking points. It doesn't say that. It says at some point, within this unit, speak about residential schools. listen, I could speak about residential schools for an entire unit. So it becomes a lot more vague and nondescript than you think it would be. So, but at the very least, mentioning these things at least opens the door for healthy discussion and debate and bringing all ideas to the table. Like when I was a kid, there was no, I've never heard, when I went through all of my education to my master's, never once heard of residential school. Never one time. And I was teaching for a good 10 years, probably, maybe not quite, before that it was in the curriculum and in the textbook in any other way than saying at the side of the margin, residential schools were used to help foster relationships between Indigenous and like that stupid little blue writing before it was actually something legitimate. So to change it like this is incredibly impossible. But didn't Jason Kenney get in there and he did tackle education a little bit, because he did change? What were the nature of some of the aspects he changed? 'Cause I know he changed a lot when it came to, he sounded like he was parroting an awful lot, a little of DeSantis, in the sense of, we're not going to focus on the negative stuff anymore here, guys. We're going to focus on my dad who sang the blues or something. People
Yeah.
are really,
Oh, good memory. So one of the ridiculous aspects of the UCP curriculum changes is, again, they scrapped the NDP curriculum, even though, again, I know because I was there. We had curriculum experts. We had,
of course.
with expertise in developmental appropriateness, all the things, right? I don't have to list everybody involved, right? And then, yeah, Jason Kenney.
I think we do, by the way. We should do another one because I think we do. I think there needs to be a whole podcast talking about what goes on curriculum development, because I swear to God, people
Yeah.
think that just one, NDP, liberal, or even conservative candidate sits in a room and comes up with crap rather than basing it in real science and psychological and sociological development for age appropriate, intelligent individuals. But
Yeah,
continue.
no,
So,
and the other big challenge is people don't know the difference between curriculum and pedagogy, right? And just
sure.
classroom environments, right? So, people will say, like, again, we're hearing like, oh, there's all this stuff in the curriculum, which is absolutely not true. But they see a pride flag in the school and think that's curriculum. Like, no, this isn't curriculum, right? And so, again, that's a lot of the challenge that we have ahead of us, is to try to explain to people what's actually happening in schools from a curriculum standpoint, and from a what's happening in this at the school level, right? But again, that's a whole other conversation. But you're right. So Jason Kenney did come in, and he clearly had his fingers on some of the curriculum documents, because I can't even remember the name. I love that you remember that. What was his name? Mart Kenney. I think it was like Jason Kenney's relative, who was like a
I think
musician.
it was his dad or his grandfather.
Yeah, like
They
something.
were
Mart
giving
Kenney, right? So stuff like that, right? Yeah, and of course, just very much making curriculum a very much a political wedge, even though they would say that we were politicizing it. It's like, no, we consulted so many people, and in fact, curriculum development had kicked off under the previous PC government, right? There was these conversations happening since like 2010, which is way
right.
before UCP came to town, right? So, having worked there, because I worked with the Ministry of Education for years under a PC government, right? Then under the NDP, and not under the UCP, because I was elected by then, right? But you could see that this was not a political process prior to the UCP coming around, and suddenly it was Jason Kenney's uncle or whatever the heck it was, who was being named in the curriculum. And that was the other wild thing. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. How much time do we have? But like,
Much as you want.
yeah, that's right. We really much moving away from those very prescriptive curriculum documents of the past, right? You can look at Alberta social studies. Again, I know too much about this, but you can look at Alberta social studies curriculum documents from decades ago, where it was rote learning, where it was list of topics that you needed to memorize. We know that's not how kids learn, and that's not how that's not the way in which they should be learning. And this is where we were seeing this step backwards to this kind of rote learning. And there was an example, and I'll get this wrong, but I believe Genghis Khan was mentioned in like grade 2 social studies or something, again, because Jason Kenney would come from the school of, oh yeah, kids need to, they need to memorize the names of, it was just ridiculous, right? So Anyways, let me take.
I think that the certain people take education and what they want to do is simplify it and give the pretense of objectivity. And I've always laughed at the notion of objectivity in education. And I don't mean that in a people are trying to indoctrinate your kids. I mean that in a very practical and realistic notion that we are all biased in teaching from a Canadian, for the most part, French, English perspective, Judeo Christian. That's our bias. That's where we're coming from. So let's put that on the table right away. And I think they like to give the pretense when we get into a bunch of critical thinking and you get grade 5, grade 6, grade 7 kids critically thinking or allowed to have conversations. All of a sudden, the more traditional aspects of our culture and our generations go, oh, no, 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 I don't like that. I don't want them critically thinking because now they're going to be critically thinking about the things I expect them to do and the ways I expect them to interact. And now they're challenging me. So in fact, when you open up education and you make it less dogmatic, you make it more critical, it actually opens up way more conversations, way more areas, way more perspectives. But there's the parent right thing. Because what, in my opinion, the parents' right activists, outside of the scared ones that have been misled by really bad information, what they're really looking to do is indoctrinate what they really want to do for their kids, and they believe it is their right since they're their little tiny biological property. They are looking to how can I make them just like me, and whether that's in whatever capacity. And if education is competing with that, I want to stop that heads off because obviously I've always said this. People say, well, don't you like any tradition? I said, well, if it serves, sure. Like I love Thanksgiving. My family got complicated for a minute. I stopped. I didn't keep doing it because I thought bashing my head against the wall was good during, because it was Thanksgiving and I always do it. No, no, no.
Yeah.
You don't have to do it when it no longer serves and it's no longer beneficial and useful in your life. And that's true for everything. So when they say things like, well, I don't want them talking about parents should have the right to say when I talk to my kid about gay kids or when I talk to my kid about gender or the trans community or when I talk to my kids about, and I'm like, but would the same logic go if a parent called in and said, I don't want my son or daughter playing with the kid who happens to be Jewish? It's my parent's right, isn't it? Isn't that the same logic? Isn't it the same logic that segregated schools? It's a parent's right. I mean, that's you are using the exact same logic that fostered such horrific anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic culture, racism and bigotry. You are now using it. You've shifted it all. That's all wrong now. But you've shifted it all to make the exact same arguments, the exact same premise against a whole different kind of community because you think how you think and who you want your kid around is.
Yeah, no, and you know what? One of the interesting things is and I heard this a lot, working in curriculum too. Just like there's this fear of change, right? So,
Huge.
parents also saying, "Well, I want my
What
kids to
is
learn what I learned," as if we can't shift. I
better?
still remember, there was a conversation around diploma exams, which we have these exams that are worth like 50% of your grade in grade 12, and I still remember parents being like, well, my kids should have to write these exams because I had to write them. And I'm like, well, yeah, but can we at least kind of, assess the psychological impact, the need? Does it have to be? We know there's a lot of research around high stakes testing and 50% of a grade, right? Like, so, and just the absolute hesitation, even from people internally in government to like have these conversations because like, no, this is the way it's always been, right?
It's always been. And that's tapping into two things. Number one, fear of change. But number two, this ridiculous sensation of nostalgia. Trump got elected under it. The idea of make America great again. The reason why that was so unfortunately brilliant is because no matter who you are, I could show you a whole wall of toys I have over there. No matter who you are, if I can tap into your sense of nostalgia when you were a kid and you felt safe and happy, no sense of responsibility, you felt like things were good. First of all, you were wrong. You were just unaware. Number one, you weren't, that's not what it was.
Yeah.
But if I can tap into that, right? And then I can tell you I'm going to bring it back.
To the good old days. Yep.
Nostalgia is a freaking, first of all, it cost me a lot of money, but second of all, it's one of those easily to manipulate individuals, right? To do a lot of really horrifically stupid things. And we've seen it throughout the United States. And unfortunately, it's pushing up here in a grand sweeping scale. But I think they really like with those tests and standardized tests, they like the idea that they can do something quick, easy, and cheap in order to assess somebody's academic or intellectual potential. Everybody in academia knows that's bullcrap. Doesn't work. Can't be cheap, it can't be quick, and it can't be easy. That's not what learning is. It never can be those things. But if I can convince a population that I can do it cheap and quick, and it's not going to cost them any more tax dollars, and it's going to be objective, and I'm going to get a clear picture, and it's going to be a throwback to when you were a kid, vote me in now.
Yeah.
I could run on that tomorrow.
Yeah.
And
Although what's interesting is, I mean, because I worked in it a little bit. There's a lot of resources and money that goes into assessment in Alberta, just as one example, right? But
oh,
regardless,
sure.
it is just so fascinating to also hear that argument that, like, well, I went through it, I had to do it, so my kid should have to do it, or every kid should have to do it, right? And just, yeah, and I mean the educational research has shifted a lot, and it's worrisome that we have policymakers that aren't willing to, when it comes to curriculum, to
Mhm.
to look at best practices for curriculum development and implementation. And no, that's going out the door, right? Because of ideology.
All right. What do you think about, and I've tossed this around, I've obviously never been in politics, but what do you think about education provincially being nonpartisan, meaning the government in power never gets to decide any of it? They can, it just needs to be a separate functioning entity that is, still government run, and maybe you have conservative members, you can have all of the people in it, but those people don't change depending on what the government changes, because they're not politicized. They are functioning on a academic, social, psychological, child development centered model to do what's best for education, irrespective of who's in government.
Yeah, I mean, like, dream world for sure. That sounds no, but that, yeah,
Why
but
does it have to be a dream?
I
Doesn't
know, I know, and it's
rational.
and truly, and again, we're in Alberta, where this the conversations around fiscal conservatism, and just, those, that language is always used by the governing conservatives, and yet, the millions of dollars, and the hundreds of thousands of hours that went into those curriculum drafts under the NDP government, and that were just tossed out, right?
Right.
Without, like what an example of government waste right there. But to your point, had you had this, again, how it would work, we'd have to work that out. But yeah, if you had this standalone,
Yeah.
arm's length body, right?
Should it
That
not be a fourth branch of government? Should it not be Supreme Court esque? Is education not that? First of all, I'd nationalize education. No, like, it should be consistent across Canada. But should it not be Supreme Court esque in the sense that it doesn't tap into the other branches? It is a standalone. It has its own power. It has its own sort of consistent sense of funding, and it makes so much more sense to me. And then not only would you not get all that waste, heaven help us, we would get consistent curriculum throughout the ages that might not be perfect, but is not going to leave kids with 1998 sex ed curriculum that I took, because Doug Ford doesn't want to talk about gender because it mucks up his base.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, listen, you're preaching to the choir on this one. So yeah, no, and
let's
I
do
mean,
that.
and that was part of what was baked into our curriculum model as well, is curriculum renewal. In that, what would happen historically with curriculum documents. This as a teacher, you'd get that you'd get that document printed off, and that was your guide. I'm talking 20 years ago when you and I were both starting to teach. I guess 20, not 20 for me, but 15. I can't, again, not a math teacher. Anyways, you'd have that document, and you'd work through it. And yeah, I still remember, actually, a great example. Oh my gosh, when I started teaching, which was 2006. So yeah, I guess 18 years ago. We still had an older social studies curriculum, and the textbook, and of course the textbook, for anybody who doesn't know, is not curriculum. But regardless, it was so funny because the textbook, it was about the social studies 30, the grade 12 curriculum at the time, was still about the Soviet Union and whatnot. And this
Right.
textbook, I'll get it wrong, but it basically ended with, like, because the textbook was written in 1987, and of course
Oh, there's
collapse of
not
the
even a
Soviet
collapse
Union.
of you.
Yeah, right. So this textbook, which was funny, like, I didn't use it very much with the kids, but the textbook ended like, the Soviet Union is at a time of change. What will happen next? Right? Like, it was just like, and
I wish I still had that
right?
textbook. I would want to frame that last page because I think that's amazing. What I also find amazing is I start every year by handing the kids, sitting down, telling them the textbook they have to buy and showing it to them, give them the cover or whatever. I said, this guy, you gotta go buy this, tell them where to get it from. And I said, so guys, this goes from 1914 to 2000 and it's this thick. What do we think? And they'll kind of look at me and they'll be like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, a lot of people want their students to be aware of my bias. Yeah, I want you to be aware of my bias. I want you to be aware of mistakes made in this book. I want you to fact check things, blah, blah, blah. You know what I want you to be more aware of than that? Because you can. If I say something to you, my kids will be on their phones and they don't believe me. They're like, Joanna, like they're checking me real quick. That's not the danger of education, in my opinion, or the danger of media, or the danger of all these things people talk about. It's not about what's in it. It's about what I decided not to even touch. That's the scary part. What's not in this book?
Yeah,
Why is it not in the book? This is like maybe 400 pages for how many years?
yeah,
Who decided what goes in there? Who decided what's excluded from that? Now that is an interesting conversation, but that's not one anyone ever talks about. I can see somebody's bias coming a mile away. I can't see what they left out. I can't see which is why when I was a kid, never knew about, residential schools. Had no idea. I couldn't question it. I couldn't even talk about it because it was never put in front of me in any significant way. And well, I didn't have the internet. So there was that as well, right?
yeah. And again, and when you told that story, I was like, this is totally me as well. Like, same thing. I didn't know about residential schools until I started teaching. Right. I mean, we didn't learn about it in the previous social studies curriculum. And now, fortunately, we have a newer, it's now like, 15 years old, a newer curriculum that just came in just as I was starting to teach. That residential schools are embedded throughout the curriculum at various grade
Yeah,
levels,
here
which is
too.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. But again, same thing. Like, I had a lot of conversations about that with teachers too, and like a lot of teachers, like you talked about. I mean, you and I we're settlers on this land, and like I know how many teachers were very much struggling to teach residential schools, not because they didn't want to, but because they just felt so ill-equipped, right? And so,
Look, those are hard conversations to have. If we're being brutally honest, we don't sitting in front of your because I know that I talk about it with even my grade sevens and eights, and sitting and talking about what went on in those schools to those kids is horrific. But in the same breath, I have we did a very large art project the other year, last year, for Ruby Bridges, and my kids did this sort of a replica of that very famous painting. And I'm like, if that 6-year-old can walk into that school surrounded by US Marshals while parents are shouting out parental rights, throwing crap at her, my grade 7 and 8s can talk about this,
yeah.
right? That's the bottom line.
And this is it, and that's where this is where it's so important that the teachers, of course, have the resources, the professional development to guide them along this journey. And it's one of the really interesting things. And again, the social studies curriculum in Alberta was done well. It was done over a number of years, again, like with previous PC governments.
Right.
they did a really good job of like, you can have conversations around residential schools with students at young ages, right?
Hmm.
You start as early as kindergarten talking about belonging, right? And
That's it.
without talking about the brutality of residential schools,
Yeah.
you can start those conversations though around um isolation and around like there's ways that you can really, that you can really help, scaffold kids learning so that when they are ready for those deeper conversations about residential schools, they've had that groundwork laid for them, right? So
Well, and again, we will tap into some of the issues that are going on today and things that our people are fighting. But you talk very, very specifically, as young as possible, about how important it is, how powerful, how amazing it is that each individual kid has their own identity that will be respected. And you can run 17 different ways to Sunday with that word identity, but it goes into every single thing that makes up that kid. And don't we want them to feel empowered and incredible and strong and confident about every single part of themselves?
yeah,
From the
that
way they do their hair to the clothes they choose to wear to the names they want to be called, all of it, every aspect, to the religion they practice, to where their family comes, to the languages they speak. And how dare parents use parental rights to try to mitigate that for some children? It makes me so frustrated that I actually have sometimes very hard times trying to have that conversation. People will say, Joanna, why are you always so calm and cool or whatever in your TikToks? I'm like, because I don't release the ones where I swear.
yeah,
I delete those ones because I wasn't articulate. I allowed my emotion to usurp the incredibly important message. So I wait, I take a breath, I have a tea, and I do it again. I do it again, so the more important thing gets across. But that's the foundation of everything. And you can talk about trans issues all you want in a specific category of identity, but that's just an aspect of a huge part of identity that we should be moving mountains to allow kids to have. Moving
exactly.
mountains.
And I think that's the hardest part. And that's why, I always reflect on, and I very much acknowledge my privilege, right? I'm a white cisgender woman with a lot of privilege. I'm like you, I'm comfortable in my identity and my sexuality, but I remember too well when I wasn't. And I think right now about that kid with two mums, right?
Yeah.
Seeing these protests with that kid who's struggling with their own identity right now, right? That kid who's being told at home that feeling that way, or the feelings that they're having are wrong, are invalid, right? And this is where it's like, shit, I mean, i don't I don't want to be spending so much energy being angry at these people that are promoting hate, because I want to spend a lot of that energy making it so those kids feel safe, right? And
Absolutely.
right, to get there though, we have to tackle the hate. So I've been thinking about it a lot. It's just because it's I really thought, and I know you probably were feeling this too, I really thought that things were getting better for a while there, right? I just thought, like, you
Sure.
know what?
But
We're
there's
gonna,
always a pendulum,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
There's always a pendulum.
there
Like
is. I know.
when I started teaching, I remember my kids, I wasn't out when I started teaching because I was terrified I was going to get fired for being gay. Um, which by the way, I work at an amazing school, 21 years. I mean, obviously wasn't an issue, but I remember my kids, I always taught politics, heavily debating whether it was okay to be gay. Like half the room saying yes, half the room saying absolutely no. And I remember going, what is going on? And then, like 5 years later, that debate went away, and everybody was bored by it because they're like, "Who cares?"
Yeah,
And then they would debate gay marriage,
yeah,
and then that went away. And then they would debate gay adoption, and then that went away. And here we sit at the next massive debate. But here's the funny part: the debate's not happening with kids anymore. Because you know what kids think about all this? Nothing. They think nothing. A kid will come up to them and say, "Oh, what pronouns do you want to use? They, them? Okay, cool. Are we going to play basketball today or do we have?" That's it. That's as much thought, unless you're being specifically programmed. And the reason why I think these protests are happened in this way is because those adults that are trying so carefully to curate exactly how their kids think and who they accept in their lives and what's okay and what's not okay for their whatever their reasoning is, those same kids on the whole, not the ones that get on CBC saying horrific things, but on the whole, those kids are coming home saying, oh, my friend Sally goes by they, them. It's so cool that they can just choose that. Off to the room they go. And then their parents go, what?
What's happening in the school?
My kid is accepting something? That's where it's coming from. So
Yeah.
this pushback we're feeling, it will be washed away just like all the rest of the bigotry, just like it always has been. This is the part we have to weather.
Yeah, I don't know. And again, it's probably just because it's been really on my mind so much. I want to be hopeful, and I think I don't think we can sit back. And not that you're saying this, but
No,
just
absolutely
using.
not. Yeah.
I do think like we really do. There needs to be a concerted effort from a lot of people to show up. And I think again, because I'm in the Edmonton context, I just have to tell you, like, so I showed up to the protest late because I had meetings that I couldn't move, and so I got there, and when I got there, the people on my side, for lack of a better way of framing it, were marching, and so a couple of people had stayed back, but then it was all of them, and so it was like, it was it was just heartbreaking for me because there were so many of them with some really awful signs, and of course they saw me, and many of them recognized me, so I was immediately targeted, and people filming me and yelling at me, whatever. Again, I don't care. I can handle that. I'd rather it be me than a trans kid getting attacked for sure. But what you said the point about kids, and I agree. Like for the most part, kids don't give a care, right? They don't. Like for the
They
most
get
part,
it all. It's
kids,
already, yeah.
yeah, for the most part, kids have moved along, but I'm very worried. And again, this is from the context that I'm seeing that things are shifting a little bit there too, because one of the things that happened at the protest last week in Edmonton is our people were marching by the local high school where the march was taking place, and there were a number of high school students there who were yelling obscenities at them, who were following them, who were giving them the middle finger. And this is like at a school in a progressive part of Edmonton. I mean, all of Edmonton is NDP, right? The whole city of
Mm.
Edmonton is orange, and so like this is happening. This is happening here in Edmonton. And so I guess it's a call to me and to elected officials and to teachers and to anybody who has the platform and the ability to teach and to educate to be vigilant and to realize like this. It feels like things are shifting in a really significant way, and clearly a negative way. And again, maybe it's just the way I'm feeling right now, Joanna. But like, I'm
No, I
worried.
understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I do think though, because again, 21 years of teaching, I do think those angry kids, and those are the kids you're talking about, given the right, because I guarantee they come from, I would put money on abusive homes, 100%. I put money, the kids shouting obscenities and giving the finger, they come from very problematic homes. Kids that come from those homes are looking for an outlet, and we are seeing them being able to utilize this as a rage outlet when 5 years ago it would have gone somewhere else. We just wouldn't have noticed. That's it's a genuine, it's a general understanding because you see those kids turn it, they end up becoming that bully. They end up becoming, maybe joining groups of people they shouldn't be joining, or getting involved in criminal activity they shouldn't be joining. All of that is the outlet of stuff that's gone on, and that's unfortunately transcendent. Because if we really started looking at the damage that's being done to our youth, if we really started using that, if we started looking at SA and what goes on, everybody's so concerned about sexualization of kids and, using the G word and all of that kind of stuff, we really started admitting where that's happening, the call's coming from inside the house. It is. It always has. Statistically, we're talking easily 75 to 80% of horrible things that are happening to kids are happening within their homes. So that's something where I sit back and go, because then it's just this horrible snowball. This horrific snowball, right? Then I start to think, now what do we do? The more of these parent rights, because what I've been thinking of a lot lately, and I think it's going to align with what you're saying, is where's the child's right?
yeah,
Why aren't we talking about, we can talk about parent rights, teacher rights, police rights, nurses' rights. Where the hell are we talking about inalienable rights and protections that kids have, and I'm not just saying somebody that 5, but I sure as hell am including them. Where do we start talking about what their rights are? Because I'm real tired of hearing them as being extensions of parental property for them to do with it whatever. Because everybody's like, well, that's the way it is. I'm like, no, it's not. We've been putting more and more limits and rational laws on parents. So they just can't do whatever the hell they want. We've changed, right? We've grown. Maybe now is really the time to start understanding what kids should have the right to be and say and how they should have the right to live. And I think it has to start with the inalienable right to a common, rational education. Because if I take that away from a kid, if I take that away purposefully in order to indoctrinate, in order to convince, in order to limit, I don't understand how that is an abuse.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you on that, and I want to clarify too. Like, those kids, I'm not mad at those kids that were
No, you
spreading,
can't
right,
be. You
right.
know, you know that it's coming from something. Yeah.
Yeah, and you just think about, like you said, what's happening at home.
Yeah.
Guaranteed, some of those kids spreading hate are struggling themselves, right? Absolutely,
Absolutely.
and it's a way of
Yep.
pushing back and repressing and all the things. And I also think back, and I've told this many times, and I don't mind saying it, and I'm sure you have similar stories. Like, I myself was homophobic as a
100%.
little kid, right?
My
Like,
whole
I remember,
school. Yes.
right? From rural Alberta, not that means that I'd be homophobic, but like, I remember you mentioned gay marriage. I remember that debate in high school. I remember being like, gay people can't get married, right?
You
You
can
know,
get
like,
married. What?
ridiculous. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
And even as an adult, like, I remember being in university and having a conversation around bisexuality and just saying the most ridiculous, like, thinking like, oh, as if you could be attracted to, like, come on,
Right.
like,
Come on.
pick a gender, right? And I'm like, so
There is.
I always, and you know what, and this is where, your whole podcast and your TikToks are just so, the whole, the learning and the unlearning is just so, so critical, right? And again, I don't think it's just because we're educators. It's just that this is the time, right, where, I'm okay, and I've said this so many times in the legislature and outside the legislature, like, I want to talk about the fact that I've made mistakes, right? That I've been wrong so
Hmm.
many times, and that,
Yeah.
because that causes me to respond to other people with empathy. Another example, I remember the first time one of my friends about 10 years ago said they were using they them pronouns. So, I was mostly a social studies teacher, but the English teacher in me was like, wait a minute. Like,
Wait a minute.
I probably won't even remember, but, like, what is it? Subject pronoun agreement? Like, no,
I'm
it
not
doesn't
into
work.
that. Doesn't
Yeah,
make
yeah,
any
like,
sense.
this doesn't work grammatically.
Right.
Like, there's no way, right? And again, this was me 10 years ago when I was already starting to come out myself, and I was right. So I have a lot of compassion, I guess maybe is the word,
Sure.
understanding for folks who are, struggling with um, ideas around
Change is a lot. It feels like a lot.
pronouns, it's what it means to be transgender, the cisgender, the list goes on, right? Like, I was there, so I get it, right?
Yeah.
But it's one thing. So to come back to what you started with in this podcast, like, it's one thing to to be willing to engage in these conversations, but there are those people who are so closed off, right, and that respond with hate. And so,
So hard. Yeah.
I want to be able to talk to people who disagree, because I've been there, right? Or people who are coming across as prejudiced or homophobic, whatever it might be. But if they're not coming to me with a place of being willing to listen and talk, it makes it challenging. So
Absolutely.
I'm ranting now. So
You're not ranting. I think that was amazing. And I think I've taken up a whole hour of your time. So I'm going to try to limit it. Can you give me one, and it could be completely off point, but can you give me, if you were could describe you and what you stand for in the NDP and Alberta, what do you think maybe the top 3 things that you stand for, that you would support or that you would fight for within your province right now?
what, like,
You get
you
3.
okay, this is, like, just so the audience knows, we did not prep this at all. So, like, that's
Oh,
like,
we do.
no, so this is a little tricky for me to just, like, think
Of
of off
course
the
it
top of my
is.
head. Three things. So, this is me
It-
stalling here. Look at that sun on my face for the people watching.
That's nice. Where's the
No,
cat? You can
I know.
point her out,
I am
Jen.
wondering where oregano is, but hopefully he'll come back. Oregano. Um, Three things that I stand for. Gosh.
Because I think I'm going to vamp so you can have time to
Okay,
think.
yeah,
Because
thanks.
I think a lot of times the average voter gets a little bit frustrated with the lengthy list of things a lot of politicians will promise. And I've often said I would be really in love with a politician who could not say this isn't the only things I care about, but because if I gave you a list of 20, I can't do them all. I'm going to give you a list of 3 that I am going to die on each one of those hills this term. I feel like that would be a lot more, that would resonate a lot more and people could understand clearly. Now, here's the problem for voters when they're expecting ridiculousness, like bring down my taxes and give me more social services.
Yeah.
You end up marginalizing, and I get it. We have a long list, so we cast a big net. But right now, I'm asking you to just cast an authentic net, not a
Yeah,
big
and
one.
I mean, I'll be speaking for me, but I think what comes,
Yeah,
yeah, what comes to mind for me, human rights, public services, and community. And we can obviously human rights. We've talked a lot about what I mean by that. And again, it's not just about protecting the rights of trans kids and the 2S LGBTQ plus community, but thinking about my Muslim neighbors who've been absolved to so much hate
right,
in our city, in our province, and how we can really come together, right? How these communities, many of our communities, have faced um, similar discrimination and hate, and now's the time that we need to come together, right? And
right,
we need to support each other. So that's a big one. Public services, I mean, this is my way of talking about education and healthcare and the need
right.
to protect both of those things. And obviously, as a
Absolutely.
teacher and
Oh my
somebody,
God, we could do a whole other
right?
podcast on healthcare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just ending with community, in the sense that community has been something that's just so central to my work as a politician. I don't mean that just as showing up in the neighborhoods that I represent, but in the values of what it means to be a
Help one another.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to come together, and at a time when we need it. And I get accused of a lot of being divisive, and it's just like, listen, if standing up for human rights and for love and respect for all is divisive, then sure enough, I'm divisive, right?
Right. Right. I love it. Janice, thank you so much for being on my I would really love it whenever you carve out time, you throw me a text. I'll get your email right the first time on the next time. And I would love to have you back on, talk about as many things as you possibly want to talk about.
I love this. Thanks for the opportunity, and you keep crushing it out there on TikTok, all right?
And we got to have some crossovers.
Much love.
And to everybody listening, thank you guys for listening, or thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Same bat station. Dismissed.